So welcome back. We are on week 3. So our topic today is thinking mindful. Before we get started though, I just wanted to check in and see how everyone's week was. Does anyone want to share a mindful moment that they had this week? I know I say this almost every time, but for me, mindfulness usually comes when I interact with nature. So getting outside and going for a walk and just hearing the birds, hearing the wind in the trees, that kind of thing, that always kind of brings me back into the present and really helps to ground. Yeah. Does anyone want to share a mindful moment? Walking on the beach, amazing. Yeah. The sound of the ocean is probably one of my favorite sounds. And again, such a grounding sound. It's actually shown that the ocean or any sort of water as a stimulus is really helpful. It actually induces a meditative like state in your brain because we're so used to kind of overwhelming kind of stimuli at all times, whether it be on screens or just through driving and being in cities and stuff like that. So kind of being able to see the ocean is a very calm and neutral stimulus, which kind of induces that natural kind of meditative like state in our brain, which is really cool. Great. Spending time with friends. Yeah. And it's nice that we've been able to have more of that lately, and things are opening up a little bit more, and we're able to see people and kind of start to kind of navigate a new normal now. Absolutely. Walking along the beach, along the river. Awesome to notice. And the shadows that are cast. Sometimes we kind of don't really look at those things, but they can be really beautiful. I know I like to look at shadows when I'm on a walk. Our topic this week, like I said earlier, is thinking mindfully. So mindful awareness and focused attention create changes in our brain that help us regulate our emotions. So if we want to get technical and kind of dive into neuropsychology here, mindfulness plays a role where it engages parts of the brain that help us regulate our emotions, and it helps us create a sense of safety. So this happens by helping all parts of the brain work together as an integrated whole. So mindfulness activities and practicing this and kind of building your awareness and your attention retraining really helps to integrate all parts of the brain together. So they're working as a whole rather than as separate pieces. So a simple understanding of the brain can actually help us understand what happens when we are in distress or feeling overwhelmed, and how we can respond to get those parts of our brain working together again. So like I said earlier, when we are overwhelmed and stressed out, our brain tends to operate separately, or certain parts operate more strongly than others. So we're not operating as a whole. And this makes it harder to respond to things. It makes it harder to regulate our emotions. It just makes stress in general feel worse. So mindfulness regulates the stress response by strengthening that noticing or that attention part of the brain, which resides in our frontal lobe, so kind of around here. So on the screen here, you're going to notice on the left-hand side, we're going to start talking about how the brain responds to stress, okay? Has anyone ever been in a situation where they found themselves acting in a way that feels really out of their control, almost like they're watching themselves from above, and they're acting and you're almost questioning yourself, like, why am I acting this way? But you don't feel in control of that. Has that ever happened to anybody? Yeah. So when we're not being mindful and we experience an overwhelming emotion, this can be felt outside of our window of tolerance. So when this happens, this shuts down our observing mind, or the thinking mind. When this happens, we're no longer able to regulate our emotions, make decisions, use moral reasoning, and also we lack that ability to be flexible in our responses. So when this part of our brain shuts off, again, it's the frontal lobe area. It sends a signal to the amygdala, which is that emotional memory center, that middle part. Again, it just kind of resides kind of in the middle. And this is our alarm system. And this part of the brain actually stores memories of our past experiences. And this is helpful because then it can help signal us more quickly when danger is present, if we're faced with similar situations that may evoke the same responses. So this is helpful, but it's also unhelpful in the sense that sometimes if we've experienced really overwhelming things in our past, that this alarm system is more easily at the ready, and is going to be called upon more easily, which can make even small or maybe more neutral stimuluses scary or induce that kind of fear response. So when we talk about danger for us, it can be external danger, or it can also be danger in the sense of having a thought or body sensation. So sometimes for people with anxiety, a physical sensation that in itself can be pretty neutral, but when it's paired with that emotional memory or that experience or that feeling of anxiety, then that kind of signals to your brain that you're in danger, which then creates a kind of a cascade effect of other things. So thoughts, body sensations, and even actual physical danger that's around you can all signal this kind of emotional amygdala response. So when we start thinking about that difficult time or experience, our amygdala has that stored memory of this, and this triggers the alarm system in our body. And then this signals down to the reptilian brain, which is where our instinctive reactions are and our survival modes come from. And this initiates a fight, flight, or freeze response. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. So it signals to your body to get your adrenaline pumping. It changes your muscle tone. Your breathing might increase. Your heart rate might increase. So for example, even if we have the thought that we might not be good enough, or that we might be feeling out of control of a situation, this is likely signaled in our bodies as a sense of danger, which then signals that fight, flight, or freeze response. And it signals that we're in danger. And then it, again, signals to our bodies to react to danger. And this causes us more discomfort than anything. So this system, like I said, is flawed because when there's no real threat, it's just a thought or maybe a kind of a body sensation that we would normally have. I know personally for me, when my stomach feels upset, that is a trigger for me to feel, oh my gosh, like something might be happening, right? So even a neutral stimulus like that, like just having an upset stomach, which could be totally unrelated to anything. It could just be I ate something strange that day, can signal that really intense, overwhelming feelings or sense of danger that can trigger other things. So even just the thought of something difficult sends us into a defense mode, and we activate our defense mechanisms. So when we think critically or we think these thoughts often, this can be really damaging to the body because you're kind of constantly in danger mode. You're constantly in fight, flight, or freeze because if we're always thinking that way, it's always signaling to the brain that we're in danger and we need to react or be instinctive and have those always have our adrenaline pumping or always be on the ready for something to happen. So when this happens, it actually causes inflammation. And again, this causes stress on the body. So it's not healthy for us to always be in this mode of thinking. But I think a lot of us tend to be in this mode of thinking at all times. So when we talk about mindfulness, so this is on the right-hand side, mindfulness helps to regulate this response by strengthening the noticing part of the brain, again, in the frontal lobe. So if we're looking at this right-hand column, we can see that when we're mindful, when we engage in mindfulness activities, whether it be a meditation, whether it be a body scan, whether it be just a mindful walk or just kind of noticing, paying attention, this engages our frontal lobe, that thinking brain, and it brings awareness to our bodies and our emotions. So by doing this, we're bringing a signal to our amygdala or the emotional area to calm down. So by doing mindfulness and by practicing these things, by practicing a grounding technique or bringing awareness to your body, you're sending positive signals to your emotional center. And this, again, sends another signal down to that reptilian brain just to say, it's okay, we're fine, and to calm down. So when we're able to signal that emotional brain to remain calm, our stressful memories lose their strength, and our positive and we start to build up a bigger repertoire, I guess, of positive experiences, positive memories, so that these become adaptive, so that they're coded into those neural connections in the brain, so that we can rely on those more often than we rely on those maybe danger signals or those danger memories. So when this happens and we have those positive adaptive memories in that amygdala center, we're able to turn off that fight, flight, or freeze response. And this actually brings on a different system, which is called our rest and digest system. So the parasympathetic nervous system. And again, this is responsible for calming us down, sending out hormones that get rid of cortisol and decrease our adrenaline or shuts those off. And it allows our bodies to relax. It stops our muscles from being so tense. It brings down your heart rate, slows your breathing down. And again, we could say rest and digest because when we're stressed, our digestive system doesn't work as well. And it actually doesn't work at all. It stops working. So we start to digest again and just things start flowing in our bodies again. So this is a really important thing to understand in how mindfulness is working for you. And it may not seem, again, we may not see the effects all the time of mindfulness and the positive benefits that it's having on us. But if we can remember that it's again, strengthening that muscle in our brain, that thinking or noticing brain, because when we strengthen that and we have more of that online at all times, we're going to be able to avoid or minimize the amount of times our brain goes into that stress response and starts to signal us to be on edge or to be scared or to go into fight, flight, or freeze. So again, when we're able to be mindful, have more awareness, this actually reduces inflammation and stress in the body, which is awesome because that can, as we know, a lot of illnesses are caused by stress or inflammation. So this can have a really positive benefit on us physically. So the reason why we tend to be in that maybe more alarm system kind of threat response is that we tend to have a negative bias in our brains. So we tend to notice or pay attention to those negative events over the positive or maybe even neutral events that happen to us. So this is good in the sense that it helped us survive as a species, right? So when we're able to kind of get into defense mode and be aware of those things, like we were able to fight back or protect ourselves in certain situations back when we were nomads and didn't have the same kind of technologies and things in place. But it also creates a lot of suffering if we don't check these biases or we don't check the way that our thought process tends to go. If we leave this alone and we don't ever really look at it, then again, you're constantly in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and this is not good for your body. So again, mindfulness practice really gives us those skills to be able to start looking and being aware of those biases. And again, learning to control them or just decrease the amount of times or just bring your attention back to the present rather than kind of falling into the rabbit hole of those thoughts and getting stuck in that mind loop. So the more you practice mindfulness, the more your brain will remember to engage all these parts of your brain, even under stressful events, right? So the more we can flex that muscle, the more likely it is that it's going to come on or be present when we're in a stressful situation, and it's going to be easier for us to get ourselves out of that mindset or that kind of, again, entering into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. So I know in week 1, we talked a lot about doing daily mindfulness activities, whether that be meditation, etc. So this week, I would challenge everyone to practice a little bit longer than they have before. So maybe you've been practicing for 5 minutes a day and maybe you up that for 10 minutes a day, right? So as we get further along, the more you're able to practice mindfulness or include it into your day, the better off you're going to be. So I'm going to challenge everyone to practice a little bit more this week. So on the next couple slides, we're going to be talking about cognitive distortions. So we all have these biases and these thought processes that we go through in our brains all the time. So some of them include magnification or minimization. So this is just the idea of we might overemphasize something bad that happened to us in our day and minimize something good that happened to us, right? So it's that negative attention bias where we make something really important that it wasn't really that important at the end of the day, right? This also can lead to catastrophizing. So only seeing the worst possible outcome of a situation rather than, again, being able to have a more balanced view and take in, well, something could go well, or maybe something just normal could happen too, right? We can also have an overgeneralization, right? So we make a broad interpretation of a single or few events. So the example on the screen here is, I felt awkward during my interview. I'm always so awkward. So overgeneralizing maybe temporary feelings about a certain event or a moment that you had, and extending that to encompass you as a whole person, rather than just saying, okay, in that moment I was awkward, rather than I'm awkward all the time. We also have personalization. So this is when you believe that you're responsible for events that are not in your control, right? So when you kind of overemphasize your own responsibility in the things that happen around you or to you, etc., or even to the people around you. Jumping to conclusions. So interpreting the meaning of a situation with little to no evidence. And again, this happens because of that system that we were talking about earlier, in the sense that your amygdala stores memories, right? We store experiences there, and emotional experiences. So this, again, is helpful, but it's also not helpful in the sense that when you experience something similar to one of those memories, you jump to conclusions and interpret the ending of that, which usually, if it's coded there, is not a great one. But sometimes it might not be that way. It might not turn out the way that we're assuming it will. Right? The jumping to conclusions can lead to mind reading, right? So interpreting the thoughts of others without any real evidence for it. Or even fortune telling, so expecting a certain result of a situation, again, without adequate evidence. Emotional reasoning is another one. So the assumption that emotions reflect the way that things really are. So we tend to, when we are in this mind frame, we tend to, when we feel an emotion, we take that as fact, and we assume that applies to our lives in general. So feeling like a bad friend in a moment, therefore I must be a bad friend. Oops, sorry. Oh, sorry. So disqualifying the positive. So only recognizing the negative parts of a situation or an event, and disqualifying any of the positive things that could have come from that. So you might receive in say a feedback interview or an assessment with your boss. I'm losing the word, that's not the right word, but you might receive a ton of compliments on that, but you also might get some maybe critical feedback, and you tend to only focus on that critical feedback rather than counting all of the positive things that were said to you as well. We also can get into should statements. I always find it interesting, I always pick up on when clients use the word should, right? Because those should statements are kind of beliefs that things should be a certain way, but for what reason? Why do we believe that? Why do we have that thought process? And lastly, we have all or nothing thinking. So it's kind of like that black and white thinking. So if you think in absolutes, and you never feel like you're doing a good enough job at anything, or again, going back to that other example, I'm always so awkward, right? We think in all or nothing terms. Does anyone relate to any of these distortions? Like, can you, if we go through this list, do you relate to having any of these, or noticing that you tend to think in these kinds of ways? And again, these are very normal, kind of natural processes that our brain kind of goes into in thinking patterns. Most of them. Yeah, and again, I think we can all relate to times in our lives where this is the automatic thought process we have, right? These are things that we tend to think of without even noticing that we think of them, until we start thinking about it, and then we're like, wow, like I didn't realize that I did these things, and maybe it's never been brought to your attention before. And again, this is kind of another way that you can increase that noticing muscle, right? Now that you have this list, or maybe have gone through it, you can start to recognize, oh, I'm thinking in an all or nothing pattern, or, oh, there's another should, right? So you can start to have that awareness of maybe some of the ways that you might have cognitive distortions, and start to question those things and say, is this really how I should be thinking? Should. Or can I think about it in a different way? Yeah, jumping to conclusions, that's a huge one, right? And again, that goes back to that that kind of natural process in our brain where we have stored memories and we just assume, we tend to assume the worst because of those negative attention biases that we have. So we are all going to have times where we are more influenced by our reason, our logic, maybe more times where we're affected by our emotions, or when we're affected by or influenced by maybe a combination of both reasoning and emotion. So we're kind of going to start talking about there's 3 different ways that we can start to think about things. Right? So again, we have that reasoning or logical self. And this way of thinking is what we call our reasonable mind. So this refers to the self we use when we're thinking logically or factually about something. And when we think this way, there generally isn't very many emotions involved. And if there are emotions there, they tend to be pretty quiet or put on the back burner and they don't really influence the decision making or our thought process too much. Can anyone give an example of a situation where they might be using that reasoning mind or that logical mind rather than using emotion? For example, maybe at work, right? At work, we would tend to use our rational mind rather than our emotional mind. Great example, Angela, paying bills or budgeting. Michelle, yeah, in the doctor's office, for sure. So there are moments in our lives where we have to use our logic, right? We can't rely on our emotional self to make those decisions. We have to be very logical about it. And your reasoning self is important because of that reason, right? We need to sometimes use logic over emotion to be able to make decisions in a certain way. Only thinking from this perspective, though, on a regular basis can lead to problems. So for example, people who think from this perspective all the time might regularly ignore how they actually feel. And then this can lead to a difficulty managing emotions because they never really take into account those emotions. So it makes them bigger. They feel more intense. Again, like we talked about, that pressure cooker kind of effect. So on the opposite side of that, we also have our emotional self. So this is where, if we're thinking from our emotional self, we tend to feel our emotions and they feel really intense, and this influences how we act. So you react from our urges that our emotions create in us, rather than choosing how to act in the situation from a more logical perspective. So for example, I wonder if anyone can recall a time where you acted just from feeling, and you kind of just had a feeling, you acted on that feeling, and then how did that situation end up? Yeah, in arguments with significant others, absolutely, definitely. When we are emotional and when we're we're triggered or we're kind of in a highly emotional state, it makes it really hard to respond well. Right? So we have those emotional outbursts or those reactions rather than responses, and that doesn't end up very well. Dealing with kids, yeah. And like you said, especially right now where everyone's home and everyone's kind of stuck together all the time, absolutely. That can bring up a lot of emotion. Again, just like if we're always thinking in that logical or reasonable mind, if we're always thinking from our emotional self and acting on our urges or our emotional responses too often, we can also run into problems. And as we've mentioned, right? So you can probably tell from your own reflections that this is actually more often than not the self that gets us into trouble. So when we act in that emotional capacity, when we're only thinking from our emotional self, this can lead to issues, right? Because again, that can lead to really intense emotional responses or kind of big feelings. Yeah, shopping, especially, this is a great example, Deborah, in terms of shopping when people aren't social distancing right now. This can bring up a lot of fear in all of us. We feel uncomfortable now when people get too close to our bubble because we've had to expand our bubble to be mindful of the virus and social distancing and everything like that. And now when people don't do that, or people are assuming, unfortunately, that our bubbles need to be smaller and we don't have to worry about it as much because things are opening up, this can bring out a lot of fear and an emotional response in us. Yeah, and talking to coworkers, right? And they're not necessarily being very cooperative. This can also lead to an emotional response, right? So if we're always acting from one perspective or the other, it can lead to issues. And yeah, right. Thank you, Belinda. Leading with emotional thinking can lead to bad decisions, right? And not bad decisions, more so, I don't necessarily think we're not necessarily in control of those emotional outbursts all the time, right? Again, we're going into that automatic fight, flight, or freeze, like instinct response when we're thinking of emotional stuff. And this can lead to, again, reactions based on our emotions rather than responses, where responses are, we've thought it through, we're including both our logic and our emotions, and we respond in an appropriate way based on thinking about it, I guess. So like I just mentioned in that example, the other opportunity for us is to use both our reason and our emotions to be able to combine the two, and we call this our authentic self. So this, again, combines our reasoning and our emotions so that neither mode is kind of taking over, but rather you're able to consider the consequences of an action, both good or bad, and you're also able to act in your own best interest, and also consider your emotions and how you feel about the situation too. So you're not ignoring one or the other, you're including both of these things to give you enough information to make choices, to act, again, in your own best interest. So in order to get to your wise self, or what we can also call it the wise mind, we need to combine reasoning with our emotions so that neither one of them are controlling the other. So have you ever found yourself in a situation that might have felt difficult? Perhaps when you knew what you had to do, but it didn't feel like the easiest thing to do, or what you really wanted to do in the situation, but it was what was going to be more helpful or the best option for us? It's almost like you're arguing with yourself in some way. You have that mental battle in your mind, like, you should do it, but you don't, it feels really difficult, or it might not be the easy option. So we kind of struggle with making that decision on what we should do. Having to break up with a friend. Yeah, right. That doesn't feel good. You don't want to do that, but you know that that's what you needed at that time because maybe something was wrong in that relationship. Yeah, that's a great example. So again, that's an example of using your wise mind or your authentic self. So we all have this wisdom, and we use it regularly, even though sometimes it might not feel like it. But you can definitely develop or enhance that wise mind, again, by using our mindfulness skills that you've already been practicing lately. So again, when we are able to notice or have an awareness of both our reasoning mind and our emotional mind and how they're influencing us at one time, then we can combine those two things by noticing and having an awareness and make a decision that's logical, but also takes into account our feelings, and it just sits well with both of us. It's almost like when we're operating from our authentic self, we're able to take in our value system, and we're able to make decisions that feel good for us, and are in our own best interest, and they're not giving ourselves away too much to others or being too rigid in the opposite sense. Yeah, and this can lead things, Beverly, like to all these, like, to a constant internal battle, right? Where we're like, again, your example of, do I trust this person or not? If we're operating from a logical perspective or an emotional perspective, it could sway us one way or the other. So taking into account both of those things can really help us, again, to proceed in a way that feels authentic to us. So a way that we can start to use this is to think about an action you're about to take, and focus your attention on that wise self or your authentic self. So then you have to consider, what does this wise self or authentic self what is it telling us to do? Does your decision feel good? Does it feel like it's the one that you should be making? If so, then maybe you should do it. If it doesn't feel like a good decision, if your gut's maybe telling you like, I don't know about this, I don't know if this is right, then maybe you have to consider other options. And again, we always have to be careful here about not kind of allowing those cognitive distortions that we talked about earlier get in the way of maybe what we want to do, I guess. So if we're having fears or doubts, are these logical kind of factual doubts? Are they real fears about the danger of what we could be doing? Or is it just those internal doubts or that self-doubt that comes in that maybe is trying to protect us in some ways, but actually keeping us from doing the things that we want to do? So it's a tricky one. It's not an easy thing to activate that authentic self, but you just have to kind of, again, have a noticing, have an awareness of things, and just proceed, I guess, with caution in terms of weighing up both of those things and making decisions that feel good for you. Moving on, we're going to be talking about radical acceptance. So radical acceptance means tolerating something without judging it or trying to change it. So remember the definition of mindfulness that we talked about, I think, in session 1, where we know that mindfulness is the ability to be aware of or pay attention to our thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, and actions in the present moment without judging or criticizing ourselves or the experience. So radical acceptance is actually a really important piece of being mindful, because if we're judging ourselves or judging a situation or experience, or somebody else, then you're not really paying attention to what's happening in the moment. You're still being mindless rather than being mindful. So in many ways, judgment is actually the royal road to suffering, because when we judge others, you often get angry, and when you judge yourself, you often get sad, or vice versa. In order to be truly mindful in the moment and in the present, in order to be fully engaging with our wise mind, our authentic self, we have to practice being non-judgmental. So radical acceptance, it can seem like a difficult skill to have and a difficult one to master, but it's definitely worth the effort, in the sense that it's going to help us release maybe some of those preconceived notions, or again, it brings us more clearly into the present, rather than we can be in the present, but if we're still judging or criticizing, then we're not fully in the present moment, if that makes sense. So it just adds another layer of presence. So a radical acceptance, there's a kind of a story, or a little, I don't know what the word is for that. It's a little story that goes along with it, about a man who's walking down a street, and he falls into an open manhole, into the sewer. He climbs out and he looks at the hole. He's like, oh, I better not do that again. Okay? But the next day, walking down the same street, steps into the same open manhole, climbs out again and says, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I did that again. And then on the third day, he's about to step into the manhole, and he's like, nope. He remembers what happens. And he's just like, no, I already fell in 2 days ago, or the past 2 days, so I'm going to avoid this. And then on the fourth day, the man remembers to walk around the manhole, and maybe even like goes down a different street. Okay. So this is kind of the process that it's going to take for radical acceptance to kind of work in our lives, right? So it's about noticing, and it might take us longer than 5 days to become more aware of when we become judgmental, or when we're having those judgmental thoughts. But it's all about when we're being judgmental and we're having those things, we're kind of following into a metaphorical manhole there. And we continue to do it every day. So we need to start learning to become aware of the fact that we're falling into this manhole all the time, and decide, okay, maybe it's time for me to take another route. So if you have a question, Lori, if you could just put it in the chat, that would be great. Okay, so on the side here, you can see the word accepts. So this is a nice little option for us to put, to start talking about how we can use radical acceptance. So the A stands for activities. So sometimes the best way to give our mind a break from stress means inducing a stimulus to get physically busy. So here we can call upon our hobbies, maybe do some chores or other activities that serve to gain attention. Again, so we're trying to bring ourselves into the present moment rather than getting stuck in that mind loop. Okay, so things like playing guitar, maybe going for a walk, organizing your closet, maybe going food shopping, playing frisbee, just going for a walk. So getting busy and getting physically active is a good option to kind of get out of that maybe judgmental mind trap. If you choose that you want to clean or do a chore or get something done around the house, again, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So as you're effectively distracting yourself and completing you're also able to complete a necessary task at the same time, right? So this is a great way, again, to bring us into the present, use our bodies, and bring us out of that judgmental mind loop. So C stands for contributing. So this could be maybe choosing to volunteer your time to a community cause. You might help a friend who's maybe shorthanded at work. You might help out a family member or a friend by babysitting. This is, again, contributing helps you to do something productive that also requires our focus. And this can also, contributing can also be a way to attend to the needs of somebody else. And this can help us feel good about ourselves. It helps us feel like we're doing something with a purpose, or, and that feels good, right? We feel if we're helping others, it can tend to lead to a really good feeling inside. And again, we're still bringing ourselves that distraction piece, but it also allows us maybe to calm down in the moment and make more informed decisions about things that we're thinking about. If we're worried about something, etc., and we start doing maybe volunteering or helping others, then that can bring us out of that loop, and it helps us to calm down, and then we can make a more informed decision about what we're thinking about or worrying about. So the other C is for comparisons. So as human beings, we can't help but compare ourselves to others. This is a really natural thing that we tend to do at all times, especially in the age of social media. We can't help but constantly be bombarded with images or status updates or things that other people are doing. And this can really create that sense of comparison in our minds of what we're doing or not living up to, or these people have amazing lives, I don't, like all those kind of comparisons. So the point of this distraction technique is to gain perspective by making comparisons. So sometimes all we need to do is compare our own situation now versus maybe a previous time where we were considerably more worse off. So this helps us bring about a sense of gratitude. So I'm not talking about kind of going on Facebook or Instagram and comparing yourself to others as a way to distract yourself, because that's an unhealthy distraction, and that actually leads to more negative emotions and more overwhelm. But thinking back on maybe times in your own life where things have been much worse, or you felt much worse, or other things like that, again, it can bring a sense of gratitude to your life in terms of, I'm grateful for where I'm at today and that I'm not at that same place that I was before. And it helps you acknowledge maybe all the progress that you've made, or maybe all the steps that you've taken and the accomplishments that you've achieved to get to this place. So it actually might be enlightening for people to consider maybe those who live more impoverishedly and have more impoverished circumstances. So this could be homeless people, or whatever example comes to mind. For those who might have limited access to friends or family, I think we can all relate to that idea. For those, an example that comes to mind is those in seniors' homes right now where everything's shut down and they're not able to see friends or families or have visitors. Like, that's awful. That would be really tough. So sometimes it's helpful to compare for the sake of feeling fortunate about where we're at and what we have in life. So it's more of a gratitude exercise than a comparison, I guess. So just taking a moment to realize what we're grateful for, what we're thankful to have in our lives, and how fortunate we are to have the things that we have, I guess. So the E stands for opposite emotions. So this is a technique that we frequently use opposites to help us get back to or to maintain that middle ground. So for example, we can listen to music that makes us happy, and this can counterbalance feelings of sadness. Anger may be alleviated by watching a comedy routine or something that just makes you feel laughter or feel excited. Anxiousness may be relieved by finding calm in the practice of meditation or reading a spiritual book or doing yoga or whatever the case may be, whatever you find calming, right? So when we tend to have overwhelming emotions, doing the opposite of that can be really helpful to alleviate that emotion. So next, the P, we have pushing away. So while the previous techniques give us kind of a visualization of heading towards something, pushing away is about maintaining our ground and sending stressful thoughts away. So because our mind may want to hold on to stress, again, because of those negative attention biases, and we may also have the sense of, or a belief of, that we need the stress, that it helps us. If we don't have the stress, or if we don't have the worry, then we're not going to be able to move ahead or be motivated. So if we have this, we may employ tactics that help us to compartmentalize our thoughts. So even if we place them aside to be addressed later, So we may also take total control of these thoughts, write them down on a piece of paper and rip it up. That can be really, really cathartic when we're having kind of an overwhelming emotion, to write a letter or just write everything, get it out of here and put it on a piece of paper and just rip that sucker up. It feels really, really good. I would ask everyone to try that option if you haven't done it before. So by doing this, and by, again, externalizing our feelings and we're kind of essentially putting ourselves in a position where we have control or power over our thoughts, and we're able to push away what doesn't serve us. So ripping things apart, or maybe we're like metaphorically banishing these thoughts permanently. So if not, again, if you're not able to kind of get rid of them fully, that ripping paper part is really helpful in terms of pushing away or getting rid of what doesn't serve us anymore in a metaphorical sense. And again, like I said, ripping paper can feel really, really good. So the T stands for thoughts. So distracting with thoughts is a big trick that we keep for emergency use. So these are our go-to thoughts that simply and quickly distract our mind, providing valuable time to process whatever is causing maybe this newfound stress that we're feeling. So this may include things like counting to 10, or reciting a mantra, or maybe like something that was written on a mindfulness card. We do this when we're trying to fall asleep and we're counting sheep, those kind of things. So these are ways that we can start using our thoughts to distract us from our other thoughts, I guess. And then that S stands for sensations. So when stress comes over us really quickly, we need to call on a physical sensation to try and snap us out of it and provide that mental distraction. So things like splashing cold water on your face may help kind of really snap you back into that present moment, and provide some mental distraction. For some, like the sign of a bell, or even having like a grounding stone that you can hold on to. And when you're feeling overwhelmed, it just brings you back. It brings you into the moment when you're able to feel this rock in your hand. So for some of us, maybe having a certain song, like a happy song that you really like, or that really just makes you feel good, and you play that song to kind of get yourself going and get your heart racing a little bit, to kind of snap you maybe out of a sad emotion. So it's worth experimenting with a physical sensation that's easy to call upon, because it helps us act as a trigger to bring you back to your senses. So it may remind you not to sweat the small stuff, because it's really small. So things like this acronym, or these different activities or ideas that you can use, again, to bring you back to the present and to distract you, or change your thought pattern, can be really helpful as distracting techniques. And I guess this isn't to be confused with maybe unhealthy distractions. So these are all examples of healthy distractions that are really good to help cope. Whereas we can also think of other distractions, like maybe watching TV or watching movies, or whatever the case may be, whatever your distraction is. And where that can lead to maybe an unhealthy amount of distraction, right? We're not saying use these things to constantly to avoid your thoughts and feelings. We're just saying that if we're having an overwhelming thought or feeling in the moment, it might be helpful to employ some of these things to lessen their effects. And maybe it's not the time or place to be able to deal with those thoughts and feelings. So maybe it gives you a moment of pause, and then you can come back to those feelings or thoughts later to kind of really think about them and give them the time that they deserve. So by using these skills, we're helping us to be better able to tolerate stress, to act mindfully, to regulate our emotions. And by doing this and by practicing these things, we're able to remain in control. We're able to make good decisions, and we're also able to maintain healthy interpersonal relationships. So again, these things are all possible because we have a wise mind, and we're able to use both our logic and our emotions to make smart decisions in the moment, because we do possess the capacity to do so. We just have to be more aware of those things. And maybe when we do tend to fall more into an emotional self, or maybe into the other hand of just the logical self, we have to be able to, again, bring all of these things online and make a more informed decision based on both things rather than just one or the other, if that makes sense. Okay, so that is it for today, you guys. Does anyone have any questions, wonderings, thoughts about the presentation today? Yeah, so this acronym, the accepts, Michelle, is all things that you can do to help you kind of gain radical acceptance, and again, to work towards being non-judgmental, or being maybe more aware of the judgments that we have, and to avoid doing those things. Yeah, I think, Angela, that's a really good point in terms of, everything is happening really quick. There's a lot of change happening. There's a lot of things that are uncertain about what's going to happen in the future, what's happening now. So having that mindfulness skill to be able to pay attention to how these things are making us feel. And I don't know if anyone can relate, but as happy as I am that, the virus hasn't attacked here as much as it has in other places, and we're doing quite well in that regard. With things opening up and more things going back to normal, I do feel a sense of anxiety, or just worry, or just, I don't know, I just maybe feel a little bit off. And I recognize that that's just my fear, my worry coming up, because it is a lot of change, and it is a lot to take in at one time. So, and just acknowledging that I'm going to have to take it a little bit slow, to when things go back to this new normal that we're creating, because I am feeling apprehensive about that, and that's okay, right? So just recognizing our thought processes, and how we think about things is really helpful, and how our thoughts influence our bodies, and how it's all kind of connected. So no one has any thoughts or questions or anything, you're free to go. We finished a little bit early today, but that's all right. Thank you guys all for being here, for participating. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to seeing everyone next week for week 4. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week too.